Texas, October 1945. Special Agent Thomas Crawford stepped off the train in Amarillo, carrying a briefcase and orders from Washington. 3 German women prisoners were pregnant. The fathers were American civilians, cowboys, ranch hands, men who'd been tasked with guarding enemies of the state. Somewhere between barbed wire and wide horizons, fraternization had crossed into something the government couldn't ignore. Crawford adjusted his hat against the panhandle wind and wondered how you investigate love in a place where the rules of war had dissolved into dust and distance. The pregnancy of Elise Hartman was discovered during a routine medical inspection at the Hereford Processing Center in September 1945. She was 23, a former telephone operator from Stuttgart, 4 months along. The camp physician, Dr. Margaret Walsh, noted it in her records with clinical precision. Patient presents at approximately 16 weeks gestation. Patient is unmarried German national, classified as auxiliary personnel, captured April 1945. Dr. Walsh was 47, experienced enough to recognize when someone was hiding something and wise enough to know when to ask questions carefully. She examined Elise in the small infirmary room, the September heat pressing against the windows despite the approaching autumn. "How long have you known?" Dr. Walsh asked. Elise stared at the ceiling. Her English had improved significantly during her 5 months in Texas. 2 months, she said quietly. Maybe longer. The father? Elise's silence was answer enough. Dr. Walsh finished the examination without pressing further. But protocol was protocol. Prisoner fraternization with civilians violated federal regulations established when the POW program began. She filed her report that afternoon. Within a week, 2 more cases surfaced. Anna Becker, 26, formerly a clerk in a Bremen shipping office, 3 months pregnant. Katharina Vogel, 21, who'd worked in a military hospital in Berlin, 2 months along. All 3 had been assigned to work programs on ranches surrounding Hereford. All 3 had developed relationships with American men in positions of authority or proximity. The War Department received Dr. Walsh's consolidated report on October 2nd. By October 5th, Special Agent Thomas Crawford was en route from the FBI field office in Dallas. Crawford had spent 3 years investigating sabotage, espionage, and black market operations along the Gulf Coast. He'd tracked German agents in Houston, Italian sympathizers in New Orleans, and profiteers who sold military supplies to the highest bidder. This assignment was different. No one was accusing these women of spying. No one suggested the Cowboys were enemy collaborators. But laws had been broken, regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of complication. He arrived in Amarillo on October 8th, checked into a modest hotel near the rail yard, and spent his first evening reviewing the case files Dr. Walsh had compiled. 3 women, 3 separate ranch assignments, 3 American men who would need to be identified and questioned. The next morning, Crawford drove to Hereford in a government sedan, the landscape unfolding around him like something from a different century. The panhandle stretched endless in all directions, flat grassland interrupted by windmills and distant cattle, the sky pressing down with impossible weight. He'd grown up in Philadelphia, where buildings created horizons. Here, the emptiness felt almost hostile in its vastness. Dr. Walsh met him at the processing center, a collection of temporary structures that had housed German prisoners since the previous spring. Most prisoners had been repatriated by now, but several dozen remained, women mostly, waiting for paperwork, for decisions about their futures, for answers about families back in Germany. 3 women, Crawford said, spreading photographs across Dr. Walsh's desk. I need to interview them separately, and I'll need the names of the men responsible. Dr. Walsh leaned back in her chair. Her expression was carefully neutral. Agent Crawford, these women have been through considerable trauma. The regime's collapse, capture, transportation across an ocean, months of uncertainty about their futures. Whatever happened here, I don't believe coercion was involved. Crawford met her gaze. That's what I'm here to determine. The law is clear about fraternization between prisoners and civilians. If crimes were committed, these women weren't prisoners of war in the traditional sense. Dr. Walsh interrupted. They were auxiliary personnel. Clerks and telephone operators and nurses. They didn't fight. Most surrendered willingly when given the opportunity. Nevertheless, Crawford said, opening his briefcase, they were enemy nationals under federal custody. The men who fathered these children violated regulations. I need names. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a different file, one she'd prepared knowing this conversation would come. 3 ranch assignments. 3 families who'd requested German workers to help with domestic labor and agricultural work. The Mackenzie Ranch, the Harrison Spread, and the Callahan property. She slid the file across the desk. You'll find your answers there. Whether you'll find crimes is another matter. The Mackenzie Ranch sat 12 miles southwest of Hereford, a modest operation focused on cattle and horses. Crawford drove out that afternoon, the sedan kicking up dust along the unpaved county road. He found Sam Mackenzie repairing a fence near the main house, replacing a rotted post with fresh cedar. Mackenzie was 34, too essential to ranch operations to have been drafted. He'd grown up on this land, inherited it when his father died in 1940, and ran it with the help of 2 hired men, and, until recently, a German woman assigned through the labor program. Crawford introduced himself, showing his credentials. Mackenzie set down his post-hole digger and wiped his hands on his jeans. His expression didn't change, not surprise, not fear, just a kind of resigned acceptance. I figured someone would come eventually, Mackenzie said. He gestured toward the house. We can talk inside. My wife should hear this too. Crawford followed him into a kitchen that smelled like coffee and cornbread. Martha Mackenzie was 31, a schoolteacher who'd given up her position when they married. She poured coffee without being asked, her movements precise and controlled. She knew why Crawford was here. They sat at a wooden table scarred from decades of use. Crawford pulled out his notebook. I'm investigating the pregnancy of Elise Harkman, formally assigned to this property. I need to understand the circumstances. Sam and Martha exchanged glances. Sam spoke first. Elise came to us in April. She was supposed to help Martha with cooking and cleaning, maybe some garden work. The program said we'd be assigned enemy labor, that we should maintain distance, treat them as prisoners. And did you? Crawford asked. For about a week, Sam admitted. Then we realized she wasn't an enemy. She was a scared young woman who'd lost everything. Her family died in the bombing of Stuttgart. She had nowhere to go, no one waiting for her in Germany. We started treating her like a person. Martha leaned forward. Agent Crawford, Elise ate at our table. She slept in our guest room. She worked hard, but we paid her a small wage from our own money. Not much, but enough for her to buy personal items in town. She became our friend. When did the relationship with your husband begin? Crawford directed the question at Martha, watching for her reaction. Martha didn't flinch. Sam and I have been married 11 years. We can't have children, something medical that happened after I had scarlet fever as a girl. Elise knew this. We talked about it one evening, all 3 of us. She was lonely. We were lonely in different ways. What developed wasn't planned. Crawford wrote carefully. Are you saying this was a consensual arrangement involving all 3 parties? Sam met his gaze directly. I'm saying Elise and I developed feelings for each other with Martha's knowledge and eventually her blessing. Martha and I love each other, but we also came to care for Elise. What happened between us wasn't about war or prisoners or breaking rules. It was about 3 people finding something they needed. The silence stretched. Crawford had investigated dozens of cases, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, developed an instinct for lies and half-truths. These people weren't lying. They weren't hiding anything beyond what they'd already revealed. "Where is Miss Hartman now?" Crawford asked. "At the processing center," Martha said, "but she'll be back. We've applied for sponsorship to keep her in the country. Once the baby is born, we plan to raise the child together, all three of us." Crawford closed his notebook. "You understand this violates federal regulations. Mr. Mackenzie, you could face criminal charges." Sam nodded. "I understand, but I don't regret it." Neither does Martha. Neither does Elise. The Harrison spread was larger, nearly 3,000 acres running cattle and growing winter wheat. Crawford found Robert Harrison in the equipment barn, working on a tractor that had thrown a belt. Harrison was 41, a widower whose wife had died from pneumonia 3 years earlier. His son was serving with the Marine Corps somewhere in the Pacific. Harrison saw Crawford approaching and straightened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He'd been expecting this visit. The town was small enough that news traveled faster than government sedans. They walked to the house together, neither speaking. Inside, Harrison poured whiskey into 2 glasses without asking if Crawford wanted any. They sat in a living room that still held evidence of a woman's touch curtains, photographs, a quilt draped across the sofa. "Anna Becker," Crawford began. Harrison took a long drink. "She came here in May. Was supposed to help with cooking since I can't boil water without burning it. She was quiet at first, wouldn't look me in the eye, moved like she expected to be hit." Crawford waited. Harrison continued. "Her husband died in the final weeks, not in combat, but in the chaos of retreat. Friendly fire, she thinks, though she'll never know for certain. She was 26 and already a widow. Didn't have children. Didn't have anyone." He paused, staring into his glass. "My wife, Catherine, she was my whole world. When she died, I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. Then Anna showed up, and for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty." "When did the relationship become intimate?" Crawford asked. "July," Harrison said. "Heat wave came through, made it hard to sleep. Anna had a nightmare, woke up screaming. I heard her from my room, went to check on her. She was crying, apologizing in broken English, saying she kept seeing her husband's face. He stopped, choosing his words carefully. I held her until she stopped shaking. After that, things changed between us." Crawford wrote notes. "Did you understand this was illegal?" Harrison laughed, a bitter sound. "Agent, I spent 30 years on this land following rules. Paid my taxes, sent my son to war, did everything the government asked. Anna wasn't my prisoner. She was a woman who'd lost everything, same as me. What we found together wasn't about breaking rules. It was about surviving. What are your intentions regarding Miss Becker and the child?" Harrison met Crawford's gaze. "I'm going to marry her if she have me. The baby will have my name. I don't care what Washington thinks about it." The Callahan property was the smallest of the 3 assignments, a family ranch run by 2 brothers who'd inherited it from their parents. Crawford found them both working in the horse corral, Daniel, 38, and Michael, 35. Both had been classified 4F, Daniel for a heart murmur and Michael for partial deafness from a childhood illness. They saw Crawford coming and met him at the corral gate. Daniel did most of the talking. Michael listened, reading lips with practiced skill. "Katharina," Daniel said before Crawford could speak. "You're here about Katharina." Crawford nodded. "I need to know which of you is the father." Both brothers were silent. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice carrying the slightly unusual cadence of someone who couldn't fully hear his own speech. "We don't know. Could be either of us. Maybe that matters to you. Doesn't matter to us." Crawford struggled to maintain his professional composure. "You're both claiming responsibility?" Daniel leaned against the fence. "Agent, our situation isn't what you're thinking. Katharina came here in June. She'd worked as a nurse during the regime, saw things that broke her. She had nightmares every night for the first month. Michael and I were not married, probably never will be. We work this ranch together, live together, share everything. Katharina fit into that life. She needed people who wouldn't judge her, Michael added. We needed someone who understood that families don't always look like what the government thinks they should. Crawford felt the investigation slipping away from him. This was supposed to be straightforward: identify violations, recommend prosecution, enforce regulations. Instead, he was finding complicated human situations that didn't fit into neat categories. Where is Miss Vogel now? Crawford asked. At the processing center, Daniel said, but she'll be back. We filed the paperwork to sponsor her residency. The three of us are building something here, Agent. A family that works for us, even if it confuses everyone else. Crawford spent the next 3 days interviewing the women themselves. The processing center provided a small office where he could conduct confidential interviews. He started with Elise Hartman. She sat across from him, hands folded over the slight swell of her stomach. Her English was good enough for conversation without a translator. Crawford explained that she wasn't under arrest, that anything she said would be used to determine whether regulations had been violated, whether charges should be filed. I understand, Elise said. Her voice was calm, steady. What do you want to know? How did your relationship with Sam Mackenzie begin? Elise considered the question. Sam and Martha were kind to me from the beginning. That was unexpected. I'd been told Americans would be harsh, that prisoners would be treated with cruelty. Instead, they gave me their guest room. Martha taught me to make biscuits. Sam showed me how to care for horses. They talked to me like I mattered. When did it become romantic? June, Elise said. Sam and I were working in the garden together. He was telling me about his childhood on the ranch, about his father. I told him about Stuttgart, about my family. We realized we both lost things we couldn't replace. She paused. That evening, Martha asked me to sit with him on the porch. She said she could see what was developing between Sam and me. She said she wasn't angry. What did you feel? Confused, Elise admitted. In Germany, marriage was sacred, exclusive. But Martha explained that they couldn't have children, that their marriage was strong enough to include someone else. She said if Sam and I developed feelings, she wouldn't stand in the way. Did you feel coerced? Crawford asked directly. Elise met his eyes. Agent Crawford, I was a prisoner. Technically, Sam had power over me. But no, I wasn't coerced. I was given a choice. I could have said no. I could have requested transfer to another assignment. Instead, I chose to stay. I chose Sam, and I chose to accept Martha's extraordinary generosity. Anna Becker's interview followed a similar pattern. She was more guarded initially, her English less fluent, but her story was consistent with Harrison's account. She'd been broken by loss, had found unexpected comfort in a widower who understood grief, had chosen to build something new from the ruins of her old life. I know rules were broken, Anna said through occasional pauses to find the right English words, but I don't regret it. Robert gave me a reason to imagine a future. Before him, I thought I would return to Germany and simply exist until I died. Now I'm carrying a child who will grow up in America, who will never know war the way we knew it. Katharina Vogel was the youngest of the three, and her interview was the most difficult. She'd seen things in the military hospital that had traumatized her wounded soldiers, civilians caught in crossfire, the consequences of a regime that had sent millions to their deaths. She spoke haltingly about the nightmares, about the guilt she carried for having been part of the system, even in a minor role. Daniel and Michael didn't judge me, she said. They didn't ask me to justify my past or explain myself. They just accepted that I was damaged and needed time to heal. Her hands trembled slightly. What developed between us happened slowly. It wasn't planned. It was three broken people finding a way to be less broken together. Do you know which of them is the father? Crawford asked gently. Katharina shook her head. Does it matter? The child will have two fathers who want to be responsible. That's more than many children have. Crawford spent his evenings in Hereford, eating at the local diner, listening to conversations, observing the town's reaction to the situation. The scandal, if it could be called, that was discussed openly. Opinions varied. Some residents were scandalized. The German women were enemies, prisoners who should have been kept at arm's length until repatriation. The men who'd gotten involved with them had violated the natural order, betrayed their country by consorting with the opposition. But others saw it differently. These women weren't soldiers. One farmer told Crawford over coffee at the counter. They were clerks and nurses, most of them as opposed to the regime as we were. The men who took them in gave them kindness when they needed it most. Nothing wrong with that. A woman named Dorothy, whose son had died at Normandy, offered the most surprising perspective. My boy wrote letters about German prisoners he guarded in France, she told Crawford. He said most were just scared kids who wanted to go home. He said we were all human underneath the uniforms. If he could see that while the fighting was still going on, I figure I can see it now. Those women suffered too. If they found some happiness here, I'm not going to condemn them for it. Crawford listened to these conversations with growing uncertainty. The law was clear. Fraternization between prisoners and civilians was prohibited. But the purpose of that law was to prevent exploitation, coercion, security breaches. What he'd found in Hereford was none of those things. He'd found complicated human connections formed in the aftermath of catastrophic violence. Crawford's report took him 3 days to write. He sat in his hotel room, working through draft after draft, trying to balance legal obligation with human reality. The facts were straightforward. 3 German women prisoners had become pregnant by American civilian men in positions of authority. Regulations had been violated. Technical crimes had been committed. But the context was equally clear. No coercion, no exploitation, no security breaches. 3 women who lost everything had found unexpected connection with American men who offered them dignity when they expected none. 3 relationships had formed that all parties entered willingly, with full knowledge of the consequences. Crawford wrote, "Investigation has confirmed that 3 German female prisoners became pregnant while assigned to civilian ranch work near Hereford, Texas. Interviews with all parties involved established that relationships developed between prisoners and civilian supervisors, in violation of federal regulations regarding prisoner fraternization. However, investigation found no evidence of coercion, exploitation, or security breaches. All 3 women report entering relationships willingly. All 3 civilian men acknowledge paternity and express intention to support the women and children. Medical examination confirms no evidence of physical mistreatment. The circumstances present unusual factors. These women were not combat prisoners, but auxiliary personnel who surrendered voluntarily. Their assignments placed them in domestic settings where normal human interaction was difficult to prevent. The isolation of ranch life, combined with the women's traumatic experiences and uncertain futures, created conditions where emotional bonds formed naturally. Recommendation: while technical violations occurred, prosecution would serve no clear purpose. The women posed no security threat. The men acted without malicious intent. The resulting children will be American citizens requiring support. Recommend administrative sanctions rather than criminal charges, combined with revised protocols for future prisoner work assignments. He sealed the report, addressed it to his supervisor in Dallas, and walked to the post office on a cold October morning. Dust blew down Main Street, swirling against storefronts and settling on parked trucks. Crawford stood on the sidewalk after mailing the report, looking at this small town that had become unexpectedly complicated. Crawford's recommendation was accepted by his superiors with relief. Washington had no interest in prosecuting cowboys for falling in love with former enemies. The war was over. Public attention was focused on demobilization, economic reconversion, and the beginning of the occupation of Germany. A scandal about pregnant prisoners in Texas would serve no political purpose. Administrative sanctions were imposed. Sam Mackenzie, Robert Harrison, Daniel and Michael Callahan each received formal reprimands and small fines. The ranches were removed from the approved list for prisoner labor assignments, though by that point nearly all German prisoners had been repatriated anyway. The women's cases were handled individually. Elise Hartmann, Anna Becker, and Katharina Vogel were granted residency permits based on their pregnancies and the American citizens they were carrying. The normal restrictions on German nationals were waived in light of special circumstances. Elise Hartmann's daughter was born in February 1946 at the Hereford Hospital. Martha Mackenzie was present for the delivery, holding Elise's hand through the labor. Sam paced the waiting room until a nurse emerged to tell him he had a healthy baby girl. They named her Catherine, after Martha's middle name, a gesture that made Martha cry. The Mackenzies raised Catherine together. The arrangement raised eyebrows in town, but the ranch was successful, the child was healthy, and eventually curiosity faded into acceptance. Catherine grew up knowing she had a father and two mothers, which seemed perfectly normal to her, even if it confused other people. Anna Becker married Robert Harrison in a quiet ceremony in March 1946, 2 months before their son was born. The baby was named William Robert Harrison. Anna learned to be a rancher's wife, adapting to American life while keeping pieces of her German heritage recipes her mother had taught her, songs from her childhood, stories of Stuttgart before the regime. Robert's son returned from the Pacific in 1946, and the reunion was tense at first. But the young Marine, having seen his own share of war's horrors, recognized something in Anna's eyes that matched his own experiences. Within a year, he was calling her his stepmother without hesitation. Katharina Vogel's son was born in April 1946. Daniel and Michael Callahan both signed a birth certificate as guardians. They never did determine biological paternity, and eventually it stopped mattering. The boy, named James, grew up with 2 fathers who taught him to ride, to rope, to understand that family was what you built, not what society dictated. Crawford returned to Hereford once, in 1952, while investigating an unrelated case in Amarillo. He drove through town on his way back to Dallas, curious about what had become of the people he'd interviewed 7 years earlier. The Mackenzie Ranch was thriving. He saw Sam and Martha working near the barn, a young girl Catherine riding a horse in the corral. Elise emerged from the house carrying lemonade for the workers. They moved with the easy rhythm of people who'd found their place. The Harrison spread looked equally prosperous. Robert and Anna were visible in the distance, working together to move cattle from one pasture to another. A boy of about 6 sat on the fence, watching them with the concentration of a child learning his future trade. The Callahan property showed similar stability. Daniel and Michael were repairing a windmill while a dark-haired boy played with a dog in the yard. The scene was unremarkable, just another ranch family going about their daily work. Crawford didn't stop at any of the properties. He'd investigated them once, written his report, made his recommendations. Their lives were no longer his concern, but he found himself oddly satisfied by what he'd observed. The regulations had been violated, technically, but the outcome suggested that sometimes human needs superseded legal structures. The German POW program in the United States brought approximately 375,000 prisoners to camps across the country between 1942 and 1946. Most were military personnel, but a smaller number, perhaps 10,000, were women classified as auxiliary personnel, clerks, telephone operators, nurses, and similar support roles. The majority of these women were repatriated by 1946, but scattered throughout the Southwest, particularly in Texas, were cases like Hereford women, who formed relationships with American men, bore children, and chose to stay. The exact numbers are difficult to establish. Many cases went unreported or were handled quietly at the local level. What's documented is that the War Department revised its protocols after 1945, recognizing that work assignments in isolated ranch settings created conditions where fraternization was difficult to prevent. Future prisoner programs would maintain stricter separation between prisoners and civilian populations. But for the women who stayed, for the men who chose them, for the children born from these unlikely unions, the regulations were irrelevant. They'd found each other in the wreckage of war, built families from the ruins of enmity, and proved that human connection could transcend the boundaries politicians drew. Thomas Crawford retired from the FBI in 1968 after 25 years of service. In his files, preserved now in a federal archive, is a letter he received in 1956 from Elise Hartman Mackenzie. She wrote to thank him for his fairness during the investigation, to tell him that Catherine was thriving and her unconventional family had found happiness. She ended the letter with a passage Crawford never forgot. "You were sent to investigate a crime. What you found instead were people trying to survive the aftermath of catastrophe. Thank you for recognizing the difference. Thank you for understanding that sometimes love is not a violation of rules, but a violation of the hatred that created those rules in the first place. The panhandle wind still blows across those ranches. The descendants of those unlikely unions live throughout Texas and beyond, people who carry both German and American heritage, who exist because cowboys and prisoners chose humanity over enmity." The FBI closed its investigation in 1946, but the stories continued in family photographs, in recipes passed down from German grandmothers, in the knowledge that even in war's darkest aftermath, there is room for connection, for love, for the recognition that we are all, ultimately, just people trying to find our way home.